All right, let's dive in. We're going deep on geothermal energy today. And get this, it's way more than just those touristy hot springs.
Yeah, it really is.
We've got some bits from this Geothermal Power Heats Up article, Knowable magazine.
Oh, yeah.
Published pretty recently, April 22nd this year. And it's got some seriously surprising stuff in it.
Definitely does.
Like, I always thought geothermal was all about volcanoes and those places. But apparently you can tap into the Earth's heat almost anywhere.
Right, yeah.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
The article actually highlights this project, Project Red, in Nevada. It's in the middle of the desert.
Uh-huh.
And they're generating electricity.
Wow.
From the Earth's heat.
It's amazing, the Earth's core. It's constantly radiating heat outwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that heat can be accessed almost anywhere if you drill deep enough.
So how deep are we talking?
Oh, for Project Red, they're going thousands of feet down. Temperatures can reach hundreds of degrees Celsius.
Geez, like a pizza oven down there.
Yeah, exactly.
And get this, the energy they're producing, it's powering Google's data centers.
Oh, wow.
Google.
That's a lot of energy.
So that says something, right?
It really does. It highlights the scale and the capacity that geothermal has. We associate Google with being at the forefront of technology, so the fact that they're relying on geothermal, that's a big deal.
Yeah, no kidding.
Oh,
Here's where things took a turn I definitely wasn't expecting. So the article mentions that geothermal, how they get the energy, sometimes it can be similar to fracking, which we usually think of with oil and gas.
Yeah.
And right away I was like, red flags,
Yeah.
Environmentally, is this a good idea?
It's a good question. Some geothermal systems, specifically enhanced geothermal systems, we call them EGS for short,
Okay.
they do use techniques similar to fracking.
So walk me through this.
So what they do is they inject water deep underground to fracture the rock, and that creates pathways for heat extraction.
Okay, so you're intentionally fracturing rock deep underground. That sounds a lot like what we hear about fracking, and there's been so much controversy. Does that tarnish geothermal's image? Are the risks the same?
Well, it's an important point, and the link to fracking definitely raises concerns. In fact, the article even mentions an EGS plant in South Korea. It was shut down after being linked to an earthquake, a 5.5 magnitude earthquake.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's a real concern then.
It is, but it's important to note that EGS technology has come a long way. They've learned from the oil and gas industry.
Okay.
And how to better manage risk and improve efficiency.
So it's not exactly the same as fracking then? Are there examples of these EGS plants that are operating safely and effectively?
Absolutely. There are long-term EGS plants operating in Europe. They're demonstrating that it can be done safely and effectively.
Okay.
But the concerns about the earthquakes, they are valid.
Right.
It requires ongoing research and very careful implementation.
So it sounds like transparency is really important here.
Absolutely.
If communities are going to be okay with geothermal, especially this EGS, they need to know what's going on.
Yeah, engaging with local communities, addressing their concerns, ensuring that everything's developed responsibly. Those are all key for the sustainable growth of geothermal.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the article mentioned that geothermal provides less than 1% of global electricity.
Yeah.
Which seems kind of small considering all this potential we've been talking about.
It is small.
What's holding it back?
There are a few factors. One is the upfront cost. Building a geothermal plant, that's a significant investment, especially for the EGS projects.
Okay, so it comes down to money, but we've heard that about solar and wind for years,
Yeah.
High upfront costs. What makes geothermal different?
Well, it's true that the upfront cost is high, but geothermal has an advantage over solar and wind. It's not intermittent.
Okay.
It can provide a constant, predictable flow of energy, regardless of the weather.
That's a big deal. It seems like everyone's trying to figure out what to do when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Could geothermal be the answer to that?
It very well could be. That reliability is what makes it so valuable, especially as we transition to more renewable energy sources. It's really good for maintaining a stable power grid. And it gets even more interesting. You can actually store energy within an EGS system.
Wait, hold on. Storing energy underground?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Well, think about it this way. You can plug the wells in an EGS system, which allows heated water to build up underground.
Okay.
So that trapped heat, it becomes like a reservoir of energy. And then when demand is high, maybe when solar and wind aren't producing as much, you can release that energy to the grid.
It's like a giant natural battery.
Yeah, kind of.
It's amazing. But we're not done with the surprises yet. The article also mentioned something about geothermal and lithium.
That's right, yeah. It turns out geothermal can be a source of lithium.
No way.
Yeah, which is crucial for batteries, electric vehicles, all sorts of technologies.
Oh, yeah, of course.
The hot water they extract from the earth, it's called geothermal brine that can be rich in lithium.
Wow, so it's not just about the clean electricity. It can help us get the materials we need for a more sustainable future.
It's a really interesting aspect of geothermal.
That's amazing. So we're not just talking about, powering our homes and businesses. We're talking about powering our cars and everything else.
Exactly, and it could revolutionize the way we get these materials. Instead of relying on traditional mining, which, can be pretty harmful to the environment, we could get lithium in a much cleaner, more sustainable way.
That's incredible. And I bet this ties into the whole electric vehicle revolution that everybody's talking about.
It absolutely does. The demand for lithium it's skyrocketing as more and more electric vehicles hit the road. So being able to extract it from geothermal brines, that could be huge for the global supply chain and the future of transportation.
Okay, we've covered a lot here. Powering data centers, lithium. But let's not forget about another important use for geothermal. Heating.
Right, yeah.
Just directly using that heat.
It's often overlooked. We tend to focus on the electricity.
Yeah.
But using it for heating buildings, even whole districts, it's a big part of geothermal's potential.
And we have examples of this already, right?
Oh, absolutely. Cities like Paris and Munich, they already use geothermal energy for heating.
Wow.
They've got these district heating systems, super clean and efficient way to keep buildings warm during the colder months. It shows how versatile geothermal is.
Yeah, it really does. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of what geothermal can do.
I think so, yeah.
So what's next? What does the future hold for this technology?
Well, there's definitely momentum building around geothermal.
Okay.
There are some optimistic projections about its growth, and advancements in technology are opening up some really exciting possibilities.
Okay, I like the optimism. Well, what kind of advancements are we talking about? And how realistic is this growth? I mean, we talked about the challenges, the cost, the earthquakes.
Right. Well, one exciting area is super hot rock geothermal. Sounds pretty intense, right? That's about tapping into even deeper, hotter areas of the Earth's crust. So we're talking even more energy potential.
Wow.
And then there are closed-loop systems being developed, which aim to minimize the environmental impact by recirculating the working fluid.
Okay, hold on. Break those down for me. Super hot rock geothermal, what does that even mean? And how do these closed-loop systems work?
Okay, so super hot rock geothermal, it's basically accessing these incredibly hot rocks, like exceeding 500 degrees Celsius.
Wow, that's hot.
Yeah.
Like molten lava hot.
Pretty much. And they're several kilometers deep. The challenge is developing drilling and extraction technologies that can withstand those extreme conditions.
Okay, so it's pushing the limits of what's possible.
Yeah.
What about closed-loop systems? How do they help the environment?
So in a closed-loop system, they use a contained fluid, often water, or a special heat transfer fluid. And they circulate it through the system.
Okay.
It absorbs heat from the hot rocks, brings it to the surface to generate electricity, and then it's recirculated back into the system. So it creates this closed loop.
So you're not extracting and re-injecting those geothermal brines, which we know can sometimes have harmful stuff in them.
Exactly. Closed-loop systems are trying to address some of those environmental concerns with the more traditional plants.
It sounds very promising, but what does this growth actually look like?
Well, the U.S. Department of Energy, they estimate that geothermal electricity generation could increase more than 20-fold by 2050.
20-fold. That's not just a little bit. That's a big jump. But you mentioned earlier about financing. That can be a problem. Can we really expect that kind of growth if it's so hard to get the money?
It's a valid question. There definitely needs to be supportive policies and investments to make that happen. But there are some encouraging signs. Even traditional oil and gas companies are starting to show interest in geothermal.
Really?
Yeah, so maybe we're seeing a shift in the energy landscape.
That's interesting. So even the big players are starting to see the potential. But before we get too carried away with all this excitement, we need to be realistic. How does geothermal stack up against the other big renewable sources like solar and wind? And are there any downsides, any environmental impacts we haven't talked about yet?
You're right. No energy source is perfect, and geothermal's no exception. So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll take a closer look at the environmental side of things, the potential benefits, but also the drawbacks. Stay tuned for that.
All right, so we've talked about the potential of geothermal energy, but let's be real, it's not all perfect, right? We need to look at the whole picture, the environment too.
Yeah, for sure. Geothermal has some big advantages, renewable, consistent energy, but there are environmental things we got to consider.
Well, the article mentioned something about geothermal brines. That's that hot water they pull from the earth. It can have dissolved minerals and even some heavy metals, right?
Yeah, that's true. It depends on the geology, but sometimes those brines can have stuff that could be harmful if it gets out. So managing them properly, that's super important.
So you can't just pump it back down after you use it to make electricity.
Not always, no. Sometimes you need to treat it or dispose of it carefully so you don't contaminate anything. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole process.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Even with renewables, there's no free lunch, right?
Right.
And what about the earthquake risk? We talked about that with EGS. Is that a problem with all types of geothermal?
It's a good question. The risk of earthquakes, it really depends on the geology and the specific technology. Traditional geothermal plants, the kind that use naturally occurring hot water or steam, those generally have a lower risk.
Because they're not fracturing the rock like EGS.
Exactly. They're using what's already there. But with EGS, you are fracturing rock. And like we said, there have been cases where that's triggered earthquakes.
So are they getting better at predicting and managing that risk?
They are, yeah. They're learning from what's happened in the oil and gas industry, and they're applying those lessons.
But even with those improvements, I imagine it could still be a big worry for people who live near these sites.
Definitely. Transparency is so important. Communities need to be informed about those risks. They need to be part of the decision-making process from the start.
Absolutely. It can't be a situation where a company comes in and says, don't worry, we know what we're doing. It needs to be a real conversation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about water contamination, earthquakes. What about land use? The article mentioned that geothermal development can have an impact there too.
Of course. Just like any big energy project, geothermal power plants need space. For the facilities, the drilling pads, the pipelines, transmission lines, the exact amount of land they use, it varies, but it's definitely something you have to think about, especially in areas with sensitive ecosystems or where there are competing demands for the land.
So it sounds like planning and choosing the right site, that's really important.
Absolutely. They usually do environmental impact assessments to figure out how a project might affect the wildlife, the vegetation, the water, any cultural resources. The goal is to find sites that cause the lowest disruption while still getting the most out of the geothermal energy.
It's a lot to balance. How do you even measure those potential downsides against the benefits of clean energy? How do you know if it's worth it?
Yeah, that's the tough question. There's no easy answer. It really depends on the specifics of each project. You have to look at the environmental context, the technology, the potential trade-offs. It's a judgment call.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It reminds me of those debates about wind farms. Some people think they're ugly, but others see them as, a sign of progress towards clean energy. It's all about perspective.
That's a good point. It shows how important it is to consider different viewpoints, to have open and honest conversations about the impacts and the benefits of any energy project. You're not always going to find a perfect solution, but finding a balance, minimizing the downsides and maximizing the benefits, that's the key.
Well said. It also makes me think about the economic side of things. We know geothermal can potentially provide clean energy, but is it really a viable alternative to things like solar and wind? Can it compete economically?
That's the big question. We've talked about all the potential benefits, but if it's not economically viable, it's not going to take off. So in the final part of our deep dive, let's shift gears and explore the economics of geothermal energy.
Okay, welcome back. We've made it to the final part of our geothermal deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, the science, the potential, some environmental challenges. But now, let's get down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
The money. How does geothermal really stack up against the big renewable players, solar and wind, economically?
That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, it's where geothermal has often struggled.
Yeah.
Historically, the cost has been a big barrier.
So break it down for me. What makes it so expensive?
Well, building a geothermal power plant, it's a big investment up front.
Okay.
You've got exploration, drilling, all the infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's not cheap.
It's like building a skyscraper, right? You need those deep foundations, tons of steel before you see any results.
Exactly. And those early costs, they can be a real deterrent, especially for those EGS projects, the ones with deeper drilling and more complex engineering.
Right. Those are the ones we talked about that involve fracturing the rock.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. You got to think long term. Once a geothermal plant is up and running, the operating costs, way lower than fossil fuel plants.
Because you're not paying for fuel.
Yeah.
You're tapping into the Earth's heat that's free.
Exactly. No more coal, no more gas.
So even if the initial cost is high, it pays for itself over time, especially with fossil fuel prices being so unpredictable these days.
It does. It provides stability. You know, the energy market, it can be pretty volatile. Geothermal, not so much.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's be honest, solar and wind, they've gotten a lot cheaper. We hear all the time how they're the cheapest options now. How can geothermal compete with that?
It's true. Solar and wind have become much more affordable, no question. In a lot of places, they are the cheapest way to generate new electricity. But there's a catch, a big one. They're intermittent.
Meaning they don't always work.
Right. They're entirely dependent on the sun shining and the wind blowing.
It's like a band that only plays when they feel like it. You can't rely on them to show up for the gig.
That's a good analogy. And that inconsistency, it creates problems for the power grid. You need a steady baseload source, something you can always count on. That's where geothermal comes in. Rain or shine, day or night, you get that consistent flow of electricity.
It's like the friend who always picks up the phone, no matter what. Always there for you. So even if the initial cost of geothermal is higher, in the long run, it might be more valuable because it's so reliable, especially as we try to add more solar and wind to the mix.
Exactly. It's about balance, having a mix of energy sources that work well together. And geothermal, with its steady output, it's a perfect complement to those more temperamental sources.
All right, so we've got upfront costs, operating costs, reliability. What else should we consider on the economic side of things?
Jobs. Geothermal projects, they create a lot of jobs. Exploration, drilling, construction, operation, maintenance. And these are often jobs in rural areas where they can really make a difference.
So it's not just green energy, it's green jobs. It's about supporting local economies while building a sustainable future.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the economic potential of extracting those minerals from the brines, like the lithium we discussed.
Right, that's almost like an added bonus.
It is. It really is. A whole new industry that could create more revenue and reduce our reliance on foreign imports.
It sounds like a win-win. Clean energy, valuable resources, jobs. So with all these potential benefits, why isn't geothermal booming already? What's holding it back?
Access to financing, that's a big one. Those high upfront costs make it difficult for projects to get funding, especially in the early stages.
Because investors want to see results before they put money in. But you need the money to get those results. It's the classic catch-22.
Yeah, that's where governments can step in and make a real difference. Tax credits, loan guarantees, research grants, those can help reduce the risk for investors and attract private capital.
So basically, a little push from the government could go a long way.
It could.
It seems like we need a few things to really unlock geothermal's potential. Advancements in technology, supportive policies, and just more awareness among the public.
Absolutely. It's a team effort, governments, industries, researchers, communities, all working together.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We started with hot springs and ended up talking about high-tech solutions, environmental concerns, and the economics of it all. Geothermal is clearly more than meets the eye. Any final thoughts on this energy source of the future?
I am optimistic about geothermal. I really am. It's not a magic solution, no energy source is, but it has the potential to be a key player in our transition to a more sustainable future. Clean energy, reliability, jobs, less reliance on fossil fuels. It checks a lot of boxes.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. The future of energy isn't about finding one perfect solution. It's about finding the right mix. And geothermal, it definitely deserves a seat at the table. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of geothermal energy. My pleasure.